A person becomes alone if he knows more than others. This saying, which was launched by Carl Jung, opens before us a broad horizon for understanding the real suffering of man in the face of knowledge. These words are not merely a contemplation of the relationship of the individual with society, but rather an explicit expression of the tragedy of human existence itself, where the person who saw in the collective unconscious a force that unites people in cultural and psychological legacies, expresses here the tension between individual understanding and collective isolation, as the person who crosses the boundaries of the group finds himself in an unfamiliar knowledge that he will have no choice but to walk. On the path of deep understanding that others cannot keep up with, what Jung proposes in this statement is what we can call the burden of understanding. The more the individual delves into knowledge, the greater the gap between him and others. This gap is not limited to the boundaries of the mind alone, but rather extends to include the social and cultural values that determine how do people interact with each other. When someone holds inside them truths that others cannot imagine, it begins. These facts create an invisible barrier between him and the world around him. This person discovers a hidden world, while those around him remain stuck in the apparent world. At this moment, the person who is unique in his knowledge turns into a stranger in his own country, as his quest to achieve the truth pushes him into forced isolation. In this isolation, the conflict is embodied. Deeply internal is the conflict between man's quest for understanding and his basic need for social belonging. Knowledge separates the individual from others. Jung says that when a person possesses advanced consciousness, he finds himself confronted with the shadow, that dark side of himself which includes the repressed aspects of psychological life. Deep knowledge means in many ways, sometimes facing harsh realities that lead to his inner isolation, just as the hero in existential literature faces his own challenges in the face of the exhausting reality of his existence on the existential level, reflects Jung saying that one becomes lonely if he knows more than others, the crisis of the individual in societies that do not accept difference, or rather are unable to comprehend the complexities. The truth that goes beyond the ordinary is the person who has a deeper awareness of what surrounds him and is aware of the facts that cannot be. The collective mind finds itself trapped between the demands of the group and its desire to break free from its restrictions. The dilemma lies in the fact that this knowledge does not open up horizons of mutual understanding before it, but rather places it in forced isolation, where it becomes rejected or incomprehensible by those who cannot perceive what lies behind the appearance. It is in a position it ranges between trying to understand the deep truth and challenging the standards of society that impose a narrow vision of the world on him. This existential isolation embodies the internal rift between the uniqueness that accompanies deep understanding and the innate need for social belonging. The more the individual's ability to understand increases, the more they become distant, because a deeper understanding cannot be compatible with traditions, or the familiar concepts of society that are often based on inherited ignorance or extreme ignorance. This individual remains in a continuous internal conflict between his awareness of his unique existence and his aspiration to harmonize with others. Instead of his knowledge being a bridge for communication, it becomes a barrier that separates him from everyone. This tension between uniqueness and isolation appears clearly. In works such as Dostoevsky's Demons, the writer reflects the suffering of heroes who cross borders. The moral and social aspects of the novel find characters who seek to transcend traditional concepts of good and evil in a bitter internal battle. When they transcend these boundaries, they discover that they have separated themselves from the social reality that cannot tolerate their extremist ideas. This existential rupture appears starkly in the character of Peter, who seeks to rebel against the usual values, to find himself in the end isolated from everyone and sometimes in conflict with himself. This separation is not just a conflict with society, but with the values that he believed represented his common reality. This situation that these heroes suffer from is not an individual case, but rather a symptom of the human condition that every thinker, creator, or revolutionary who goes beyond the familiar frameworks lives it. The creator who seeks to present a new understanding of life, or the researcher who opens doors that society has not dared to open yet, finds himself in a place that resembles forced isolation. That isolation that is more bitter than social loneliness, because it becomes reflecting a deeper conflict between subjective truth and collective reality, between the self that rejects mental rigidity and the society that insists on remaining in a state of cognitive and existential stability. This isolation that the individual faces is not just social alienation, but rather a spiritual and mental separation from the environment. In this context, the individual becomes in a state of constant contradiction between his attempts to reach the truth and the difficulty of communicating with those who are languishing in cognitive darkness. The more knowledge increased the distance between him and others, so that he finally discovered that knowledge is not just a tool for communication, but is sometimes another source of unbearable isolation. This existential tension between uniqueness, knowledge, and isolation also allows us to see the deep gap between man and his fellow man, which can be seen. In existential literature and in philosophical works dealing with subjectivity and existence, a deep understanding in this context not only gives the individual the ability to analyze and examine, but also plunges him into a sea of existential isolation that may be more severe than any social unit from a psychological point of view. Jung's statement stands out as a deep connection between cognitive awareness and psychological isolation, which we can link to Jung's own concept of the shadow in the human psyche. The shadow is that part of the self that remains hidden in the unconscious and includes the feelings, thoughts, and motivations that we refuse to acknowledge or that we have repressed within ourselves. In the case of a person who is more aware than others, this process of awareness brings with it his confrontation with these inner shadows when self-awareness increases. Deep thinking requires a person to confront dark aspects of himself that were previously hidden beneath the surface of consciousness, aspects that society or the surrounding culture cannot accept. This confrontation with the shadow can be painful, as the individual may find himself in a state of alienation from himself and from those around him. In this context, it becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is a means of liberation from ignorance and enables the person to understand himself and the world around him more deeply. But on the other hand, this knowledge also becomes the path to revealing aspects that were hidden in the soul, which may lead to a deep internal conflict. This conflict, the internal between consciousness and shadow, parallels the philosophical concept proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he talks about the Superman, or the omnipotent who transcends values. Traditional, moral and social to fully realize himself, but Nietzsche explains that this cognitive and intellectual superiority comes at the cost of isolating the person from society. Although knowledge gives power and the ability to influence, it may also lead to the person slipping into a state of isolation. This understanding of existence is filled with conflict between the individual society, is what makes the super-individual isolated in the eyes of others. In Martin Heidegger's philosophy, existence itself is viewed as a state of alienation. Heidegger, in his work Being and Time, indicates that man, with his awareness of his death and the limited nature that characterizes his existence, becomes in a state of existential isolation when the person begins to realizing the deep truth about his existence, including the deadly understanding of time and space. He faces a spiritual isolation represented by existential anxiety. This deep awareness that reveals the fragility of existence pushes the person towards confronting the inner shadow that was unknown to him at first, which enhances the isolation more. From another psychological angle, we find that Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, spoke about the existence of these repressed aspects in the human psyche, which constitutes the largest part of the unconscious. And when the individual becomes more aware of himself, these repressed aspects begin to appear, which enhances a feeling of alienation. Freud believes that increasing awareness exposes the person to an internal conflict between what is repressed in the unconscious and the controls and values imposed by society. This conflict can lead to psychological tension, which contributes to the growth of internal social isolation. Carl Jung's statement reflects, in essence, the deep disparity between the individual and society with regard to knowledge in a world that glorifies collective conformity and cognitive superficiality, depriving the person who possesses a deep understanding of existence of the ability to share this knowledge with others, even though society prefers a narrow horizon that is not disturbed by any complexity. The individual who seeks to transcend this surface finds himself in the position of a stranger whom no one understands. Here, the tragedy of this individual appears in his feeling of continuous isolation, as it becomes impossible for him to communicate with others who lack the intellectual tools necessary to understand his ideas. This disparity in knowledge creates an unbridgeable gap between deep individual consciousness and superficial collective consciousness, where truth becomes unattainable except within a limited circle of thinkers. This gap is not reflected in the works of philosophers such as Spinoza, who in his book Ethics presents a vision of knowledge as a liberating force that can lead to uniqueness. For Spinoza, a deep understanding of the world is a striving for human perfection, but at the same time it distances him from the individual from the group, because knowing the truth requires transcending popular beliefs and prevailing patterns of social thinking. Although Spinoza believes that this knowledge is the only way to achieve true freedom, it becomes at the same time a social burden that may lead to the isolation of the thinking person from society. The knowledge of the greater human being that transcends the limits of collective values may be a reason for his marginalization or lack of understanding by others. In the same context, we can find a match in Buddha's idea about deep awareness and what the saying proposes in Buddha's teachings. We find that the person who achieves enlightenment and rises to understand the great truths about existence finds himself in isolation. Spirituality is different from others. Although Buddha calls for communication with others and moving towards wide sympathy, but this deep spiritual journey towards nirvana may create a feeling of alienation from a society that indulges in its whims. The individual who reaches the highest spiritual knowledge cannot simply express it to others because they do not have enough awareness to understand this deep wisdom. On the other hand, in the basic concepts in metaphysics of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, we also find how man, in the era of modernity, reflects his cognitive isolation from society because of his constant pursuit of a deeper understanding of existence. Heidegger believes that contemporary man is drowning in preoccupation with daily existence and in superficial thinking, which creates a kind of spiritual and existential vacuum that the person who is aware of his existence acquires. A deeper level of additional suffering because he becomes a stranger among others who do not seek this awareness but are limited to daily or material matters. In literature, we find in Homer's Odyssey a similar image of social and cognitive alienation, where he embodies Odysseus who suffers from continuous isolation due to his deep experience that is different from those who live in their homeland. Odysseus' journey is not just a physical journey, but also an inner journey of knowledge that makes him separate from his world. Odysseus is also unable to share with others his suffering or a deeper understanding of his existence, which reinforces his feeling of alienation and difference. From these philosophical and spiritual examples, it becomes clear that deep knowledge does not always come a tool for communication or rapprochement, but in many cases it becomes a double-edged sword, leading its owner to social isolation that may be more difficult than physical isolation. It opens up a broader horizon of understanding for the person, but it may pull him away from the society in which he lives. On the moral level, Carl Jung's statement raises fundamental questions on the relationship between knowledge and moral values. If knowledge gives the individual the ability to understand existence more deeply, what role does this knowledge play in human relations? Should the individual bear responsibility for this knowledge that may isolate him from others, or should he remain within the limits of traditional knowledge in order to preserve it? In contact with the community, knowledge can turn into a moral burden that puts the individual in an internal conflict between the self and society. From the point of view of moral philosophy, we find that Hegel, at the peak of the principles of the philosophy of right, provides an explanation of the relationship between knowledge and social relations, as he sees that the individual who possesses knowledge that surpasses the rest of the people falls into a continuous conflict between his individuality and his society, and the necessity of his belonging to the group, for the mind, according to Hegel, is embodied in the external world through social interaction, and based on that, knowledge cannot be correct except when it finds a match with the group. If the individual holds higher knowledge than others, this may lead to a sharp contrast between himself and the group, which leads to his moral isolation. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in The Social Contract, expresses this moral tension differently. in his view that knowledge that does not stem from social consensus or that deviates from collective values may threaten the unity of society. Although Rousseau acknowledges the individual's right to critical thinking, he believes that the individual, he who exceeds the limits of society in his thought, may expose himself to danger through social isolation. The difference between individual knowledge and knowledge collectivism weakens the bonds of solidarity, which makes the person who carries deeper knowledge unable to express himself within the framework of shared social values. As for existential philosophy, Martin Heidegger, in his book Being and Time, sheds light on the relationship between knowledge and the individual in the face of social being. According to Heidegger, knowledge does not lead to, not only to excel over others, but to alienate man from himself and those around him. This moral alienation becomes more evident in situations in which a deep understanding of things about man is required. Living in a world characterized by high knowledge finds itself in a constant struggle between maintaining its own identity and engaging in a social system that requires compliance with general principles. Emile Cioran adds another dimension to this ethical issue in his book On the Edge of Despair. Cioran believes that knowledge, especially when it exceeds the limits of the collective mind, becomes a major source of isolation. The more the individual becomes aware of his inner and outer world, the greater the difference between himself and others. Knowledge makes him feel alienated, because others do not have the means to understand it or even to keep up with it. In this continuous cognitive pursuit and in this moral conflict, the individual becomes forced to reconsider the true value of knowledge in his human relationships. Knowledge can be utilized, often leads to isolation. On a literary level, we find that this issue appears clearly in the works of Thomas More. The conflict of the main character is embodied between his deep knowledge and isolation from society. The more he sinks into his understanding of what is beyond life and death, the more he distances himself from everyone. This isolation does not come because of his rejection of society, but because of society's inability to understand what he knows. Thus, knowledge becomes, in the novel, is a moral constraint that makes Henry lose the ability to interact with others in a real way. Likewise, we find in Kafka's works, such as The Trial, how knowledge can become a moral handicap. In this novel, the hero of the story, Joseph, finds himself facing a legal world that is overwhelmed by mystery, and his sense of isolation increases with every attempt to understand the laws that govern his existence. Joseph discovers that his knowledge of the things that are happening around him does not give him any real authority, but rather increases his alienation and isolation. Knowledge becomes in this case a tool of moral impotence, as it isolates him from understanding reality as others see it. Based on these philosophical and literary problems, we see that Jung's statement raises major moral questions about the position of knowledge in the individual's life and how it can affect his relationships with others. In a cultural and civilizational context dominated by cultures of consumption and superficiality, it becomes difficult to accept different ideas or absorb deep knowledge that goes beyond prevailing standards. Societies that focus on consumer values often tend to marginalize thought that challenges those values, which leads to the consecration of superficiality and the marginalization of those who seek to provide knowledge. Of a deeply human nature in this context, we can find another example of Nietzsche's philosophy, who put forward ideas that analyze the human condition and challenge religious and moral beliefs that have prevailed for generations. In his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche shows the central character Zarathustra, who tries to convey ideas about the higher man to people, but he faces rejection and neglect by a society that sees his ideas as a threat to prevailing norms and traditions. Zarathustra, who calls for transcending traditional humanity and embracing independent individual existence, eventually becomes an outcast and lives in extreme isolation, as his ideas are interpreted as an attack on the values on which society was raised. This social rejection of the idea of the individual, the one who goes beyond tradition, highlights the extent of the community's resistance to any real intellectual change that might disturb the existing system. The individual who seeks to uncover the deep truth becomes like Zarathustra, a burden on the system that seeks only to maintain its apparent stability. This isolation is not limited to literature or philosophy only, but it finds an extension to it. In our contemporary reality, where thinkers and innovators who present new ideas that may contradict popular beliefs are subject to rejection and marginalization. For example, we find in the global political arena that many thinkers and activists who criticize authoritarian regimes or call for profound social change often face repression and threats. Matters become more complicated in societies in which it prevails except for commercial and cultural ideologies, where critical thought is valued only if it serves the economic interests of the dominant classes. We find that popular culture often praises large institutions and consumerist manifestations while suppressing ideas that seek to provide a deeper vision of existence and man. In this context, the thinker who does not conform to this prevailing social trend is a person alienated from society and suffering from isolation that carries within it a philosophical tragedy, as Nietzsche showed in his ideas about the higher man and the society that cannot accept him. This marginalization of deep thought, whether in philosophy or in political and cultural reality, makes society more attached to its superficial beliefs and leads to deprive individuals of their right to express their different ideas, which creates a cultural environment incapable of intellectual and civilizational progress. In conclusion, Carl Jung's statement appears as a deep window that opens a horizon for us to contemplate the dialectic of knowledge and isolation, which makes man swing between the blessing of awareness and the curse of separation. Knowledge self in the midst of a world that fears confronting itself. Perhaps this isolation that Jung spoke about is not a defect in its essence, but rather an inevitable reflection of those who realize that the path to wisdom is not crowded, but rather an individual path taken by brave souls. However, the greatest challenge remains reconciling the call of reason and the needs of the social spirit between wisdom and the need for the soul, and the emotion, and between staying connected to the world without sacrificing the purity of the self. It is an invitation to think about the price of knowledge, not only as a tool for liberation, but as an existential gift that forces its owner to be a stranger in the world of the universe and an individual in a society that seeks to obliterate the features of uniqueness. In the end, I salute you, my fellow thinkers and friends of my tragedy channel. You are the ones who are going through this. With me, a journey of contemplation into the essence of man and the secret of existence. You are the ones who swim against the tide of superficiality towards the depths of truth. As we turn the pages of this contemplation, I promise you a new meeting in which we will dive together into the labyrinths of thought and the secrets of existence, where new issues await us that deserve to be dismantled and analyzed. Until a close meeting, where the word will be a beacon and contemplation a horizon that restores, formulating the features of existence.